afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. Next up, we have Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, better known as the Paleo Mom. She is the award-winning blogger behind the Paleo Mom, the co-host of the syndicated top-rated The Paleo View podcast, the New York Times best-selling author of The Paleo Approach and the Paleo Approach Cookbook, and most recently, the 4-time award winner of the Paleo Effects show. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Sarah Ballantyne.
Thank you. We've got some slides. So, ketogenic diets, right? They have become an incredible popular therapeutic tool recently. In fact, they have such tremendous therapeutic potential that they rival drugs in their efficacy. So let's think about that. The ketogenic diet is as good as a drug. And in fact, depending on who you ask, if you ask me, I would say the ketogenic diet is a drug. So if I was selling you a drug, I would be legally required to disclose potential side effects and adverse reactions. And that would be the fine print. So we see these drug commercials these days, where you have the first 10 seconds of the commercial saying all the great things this drug does, and then 2 minutes of bad thing, bad thing, bad thing, bad thing, bad thing. And not to throw Lyrica under the bus, but I'm about to. You know, this is a brand new drug for fibromyalgia. It's got some other uses. Potential side effects include, well, allergic reactions, right? That's always going to happen. Probably not applicable to a ketogenic diet. But we've got things like suicide. We've got things like dizziness, sleepiness, weight gain, vision issues, trouble concentrating, dry mouth. Things that, for many people, would overwhelm the benefits that they're going to get from this drug. When we start talking about potential life-threatening adverse reactions, these are things that are really, really important to disclose, and a doctor is going to say, hey, here's your situation, here's the drug of choice, this is what could happen, this is what we're going to monitor, this is what we're going to look out for, and you're going to go home. Your pharmacist is, by the way, going to have the exact same conversation with you. You're going to go home, and you're going to be really nervous as you start taking this drug, and you're going to be hyper-vigilant about all these potential adverse reactions so that you can stop that drug as soon as possible and then go back to your doctor and talk about your other options. So if the ketogenic diet is a drug, then we need to be educating the public about these side effects, about these adverse reactions, so that you know if you're going to decide to do this for yourself, so that you know what to look for, so that you can put an end to this experiment before it does permanent harm. Now, permanent harm might sound like a really strong language when I'm talking about food, but you're going to see shortly that that is not actually that far-fetched based on the scientific studies. Where did we get ketogenic diets from? Like, where did the idea to consume 70 to 80% of our diet from fat and limit carbohydrates and protein, where did that idea even come from? So really, it came from the accidental discovery that fasting could cure epilepsy. So, and it came from Hippocrates' observations, 500 years BC, that epileptics didn't have seizures, or what they were called fits at the time, when in a ketogenic state. At the time, the only ketogenic known state was not eating at all. This was actually used as a strategy here and there for 2,500 years. And it was our understanding sort of catching up with it over the last couple hundred years that has really allowed ketogenic diets to become the very popular therapeutic strategy that they've become. Ketone bodies were discovered in the urine of diabetics. As you know, there's plenty of people who like to make sure that everyone understands the differentiation between a ketogenic diet or nutritional ketosis and ketoacidosis, right? They're not the same thing, but that's how we discovered ketones. And it was about 100 years ago where fasting as a therapeutic strategy for epilepsy became scientifically validated and used at the institutional level. And that was thanks to some huge pioneers in this field, Guelpa and Marie being two of them, Dr. Hugh Conklin being the doctor who really popularized this. So when fasting was discovered as a strategy, it made the news. It was in newspapers. This was a huge deal. We finally have something that we can do for epileptics. And it became a strategy that was used in psychiatric institutions, which unfortunately in those days was where epileptics lived. But it was used in these institutions all over North America, all over the world, in Europe. And as this strategy was better used, there were now doctors and scientists who were starting to actually look at statistics, so we could actually determine an efficacy rate, and that we could actually start to look at other impacts of a ketogenic diet. So the early studies really focused on children. The first studies actually showed that adults didn't respond very well, epileptic adults. That was later proven to be false. But the problem with fasting is that if you keep doing it, you die, right? So as a cure for epilepsy, it has one major flaw. And what was happening with these epileptics is that some of them could go on like a 3-week fast, and their seizures would never return, or they would return at a very mild level. But that wasn't the case for everyone. So in 1921, Wilder developed this alternative to fasting that caused the same changes in metabolism that fasting did. So what we do is we eat predominantly fat, we restrict carbohydrates, restrict protein, so that our body is forced to produce ketone bodies and metabolize ketone bodies into adenosine triphosphate for fuel. This was revolutionary. So we had fasting as a cure, but not a very practical one, and we found this amazing way to have the same effect and have people not die of starvation. So Wilder was instrumental, right? He was the guy who invented the term ketogenic diet. And it took many, many years for us to understand how this was working. So if I had like 3 hours, I would love to go through the molecular mechanisms of what exactly is happening in ketosis, but it's not quite nap time for you guys yet, and I don't have that much time. But this is the important thing to understand. So what cells use for energy is not sugar, it's not glucose, it's not fatty acids. The energy currency of all cells is a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. We can create ATP from macronutrients. That's what macronutrients are. It's things that give us energy. So we can make it from carbohydrates, we can make it from fat, we can make it from proteins. The body preferentially makes it from carbohydrates when carbohydrates are there. But we have these other great ways to make energy for our cells so that if carbohydrates aren't there, we don't die. Like, yay body. So what happens in a ketogenic diet or in fasting is we specifically force the body to use fats for fuel. And what that does is we break down fats in our diet, stored fats in our body. We break it down through an oxidation process into 3 different molecules, which are the ketone bodies. These can then circulate through our body. They can enter our cells, and then our cells convert them into ATP, so we can actually use it for energy. Ketone bodies themselves have some diverse effects, which is why there's some good stuff happening here. And the lack of the side effects of using carbohydrate or protein for energy also has some beneficial effects. So when the ketogenic diet was first figured out, we knew we needed to be in nutritional ketosis, so we needed to be producing these ketone bodies so that they could circulate and go to our cells. But it took a while before we really figured out the formula. And so this was the original formula for nutritional ketosis in 1925. It's changed a little bit, but it generally follows the same pattern. So 10 to 15 grams of carbohydrate a day was used for these kids. That translates to about 5% of their diets. 20% protein. You might see variations of this that are 10% carbs, 10% protein, or perhaps just 20% carbs plus protein. But what was really, really important was somewhere in the 70 to 80% dietary fat ratio. And what they were doing initially, 100 years ago, was also calorie restricting these children, and that magnified the effects dramatically. That is something that has changed as our strategies have evolved and our understanding of ketogenic diets has evolved. But ketogenic diets, as powerful as they are, fell out of favor as soon as there was an option. So as soon as there was a drug option for epileptics, ketogenic diets were no longer used. And the interest in ketogenic diets fell off completely. And it became a crunchy granola strategy, right? It became the, oh, you're one of those, you do a ketogenic diet for epilepsy. I mean, we're all one of those, but ketogenic diets really fell out of favor. And what happened was, because it was so unpopular and it was before the internet, doctors weren't getting the proper education in even how to implement it. So that propelled its lack of popularity even farther, because doctors were not having success in it, because what they were doing was putting their patients on a high-fat diet that wasn't actually ketogenic. So there wasn't a lot of research for like the next 40 years. But there were a few important milestones. For example, understanding that the brain can use ketones for fuel. Prior to that, we thought the brain could only use glucose. We started to branch out. We looked at schizophrenia. We discovered that medium-chain triglycerides, MCTs, our favorite liquid fat to throw in our coffee, that this dramatically increased the ketogenic potential of a diet. So then we started to have MCT ketogenic diets, differentiated from ketogenic diets that were focused on long-chain fats. And even though research was limited, there were some really important studies done on animals to really start to tease out the mechanisms. Not just the mechanisms of how a ketogenic diet works in epilepsy, but even the mechanisms of what's going on in epilepsy. But every time a new anticonvulsant drug came out, and there was new options for epileptics, the ketogenic diet received this serious challenge in how to grow. But then came Atkins. And Atkins completely changed the conversation. And that change in the conversation allowed researchers to branch out even more. So they started looking at ketogenic diets for weight loss, for exercise performance, for cancer. And then the ketogenic diet exploded. So right in the mid-90s, there was an incredibly popular report on NBC Dateline featuring a 2-year-old who had gone on a ketogenic diet and had no more seizures. The Charlie Foundation was developed, which helped educate doctors, because remember, the internet is not that old. And then in 1997, Do No Harm was released, which was a movie all about this, and this just popularized ketogenic diets as a strategy for epileptic children. And now we get some real science. Now we get the studies that are looking at long-term effects, adverse effects, mechanisms. Now we get the studies that are branching out into the other effects of a ketogenic diet. This is where the meat of our understanding of ketogenic diets comes from. And it's recent, right? This is not that long, okay, maybe it's long ago for some of you young people out there, but it's not that long ago for me. And this is where the long-term studies are. So the long-term studies are from this explosion in the interest of ketogenic diets for epilepsy, as well as our interest in finding just how far the therapeutic potential of the ketogenic diet can go. There is huge therapeutic potential of the ketogenic diet. Did you hear me, Jimmy? In specific pathologies. Did you hear that part, Jimmy? So we have a huge body of scientific evidence showing very good rates of response in epileptics. Not 100%, it's not a cure-all for epilepsy, but very high rates of response. We have studies showing that weight loss on a ketogenic diet is higher percent fat compared to severe calorie restriction or fasting. There's some evidence showing it may be a useful strategy in diabetics. Some really mixed results on cardiovascular risk parameters, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. And some emerging evidence in some other modalities. Cancer, PCOS, expanding the application from epilepsy to other neurological and especially neurodegenerative diseases. And there's even a little bit of evidence showing it can be good for acne, so yay. But this is like a drug that was developed for one use, and we found some other uses. That doesn't mean the side effects and the adverse reactions goes away. In fact, if anything, it means we need to understand those in more detail. And there are a lot of reports looking at adverse reactions of long-term ketogenic diets. The majority of these come from the epilepsy research, and I'm going to show you them now. Start counting the slides. Adverse reactions, long-term diets. So these are mostly studies that looked at 1 to 5 years ketogenic diets. The majority of these studies were done in kids and teenagers, although some of them were done in adults. So gastrointestinal disturbances are common. Now, they're of course a common short-term system because when you dramatically change your diet, you dramatically change your gut microbiome. That causes all kinds of things. But long-term gastrointestinal disturbances are common and actually one of the major reasons that compliance is low in ketogenic diet studies. There seems to be a higher risk of inflammation. There are reports showing thinning hair and hair loss, kidney stones, ketogenic hypoglycemia, so a reactive hypoglycemia. Low platelet counts have been reported. Impaired concentration and cognition. This is in contrast to some epilepsy patients will have increased focus. We'll see symptoms of ADD, ADHD go away. But there's this other side of the coin where other people react in the exact opposite way. We see depression and anxiety, impaired mood, anger. Some really detrimental effects on the kidneys. There have been a variety of studies showing nutrient deficiency in a ketogenic diet. Clearly understanding where those deficiencies may come from allow us to be more selective in the foods that we choose, allows us to supplement in a very smart way. And so that is something that is easily mitigated once we understand it. But there's effects not related to nutrient deficiency on bone health. We see skeletal fracture, osteopenia and osteoporosis. We see poor growth in children. So we see children who start a long-term ketogenic diet, and then maybe they start in 25th percentile. It's actually really common for epileptic children to be lower percentile weight and height children. And we see them drop 10, 5, 1, 0.5. They have what we would call in a healthy child failure to thrive. We see a tremendous increase in infection rates, serious infections, life-threatening infections, things like sepsis, things like pneumonia, things like acute pancreatitis. We see effects on the heart, long QT intervals, so that's affecting the rhythm of the heart beating. Cardiomyopathy, like that's a big scary word, right? Heart arrhythmia. We see in a lot of these epileptic children a shift towards more atherogenic lipid profiles, so they become hypercholesterolemic and hypertriglyceridemic. I'm going to talk about that more in a second because the research on this is very mixed. We see myocardial infarction, that's heart attacks. We see menstrual irregularities in post-pubescent young women who are following a ketogenic diet. And we see death, not just in one study. So Stewart and colleagues published a paper in 2001 that was a case study in a 2-year-old girl who died of hemorrhagic pancreatitis. So that's a really severe infection of the pancreas. Kang and colleagues actually published 2 papers, one midway through their clinical trial when they only had 129 kids enrolled, and then at the conclusion of their clinical trial when they'd had 199 enrolled. So in their entire trial, they had 5 children die. 2 of sepsis infection, 1 of cardiomyopathy, 1 of lipoid pneumonia. Now, that sounds really bad. It is an infection, but the source of that is actually aspiration, which is a complication of epilepsy. So where that's related to a ketogenic diet is certainly up for debate. And 1 who had sudden death, they couldn't figure out why. Bank in 2008 and colleagues published 2 more case studies, an 11-year-old boy and a 7-year-old boy, both who died of heart attacks. And Suo published a paper in 2013. This was a larger clinical trial, 317 kids, 10 of which died, although 1 fell from a tree, and that's probably not due to a ketogenic diet. But 2 died of pneumonia, 2 died from what's called status epilepticus, which is such a severe epileptic seizure that lasts over 5 minutes that it can cause brain death. And 5 were non-disclosed, so we don't actually know the reasons for those deaths. 3 of them had left the study due to adverse reactions, also undisclosed. That's the great thing about scientific studies. We only tell you the end result if the patient went through the entire study. 2 were still in ketosis, but the parents refused to tell the study coordinators what happened. So why? Why do we have, did you count them? How many slides did I have for adverse reactions? 6. 6 slides. I couldn't fit it all in 1, or 2, or 5. So why do we have these adverse reactions? Is it because these are sick kids? Well, if we were talking about adverse reactions that were directly tiable to epilepsy, we might have some kind of discussion here. But we're talking about things that are not seen in epilepsy that is mitigated with anticonvulsant drugs. So we need to understand this. We need to understand why. We need to understand how generally applicable this is. And this is where we start to look at the mechanisms, right? We look at the mechanistic studies. Why does a ketogenic diet work? What systems is it affecting? What bad things could possibly happen from those mechanisms? And so I think it's really important to understand that we've got therapeutic potential and side effects, right? It's a drug with side effects and potential adverse reactions. Depending on your situation, the benefits may outweigh the detriments, but also vice versa. And I don't believe that it's possible to make an educated decision without all the information. So let's look at some of these mechanisms. Let's gain some insight from these mechanistic studies in order to understand the adverse reaction and to understand how generally applicable these are. Because I think that's what we're really getting at. Is this isolated situations? Is this something that I personally need to worry about? So the first mechanism I want to talk about is the effects on hormones. And I want to talk about this simply because of huge discussion in the paleo community about ketogenic diets affecting hormones. So there are mechanistic studies that have shown that in a ketogenic state, we decrease pregnane and androstenedione, which means we decrease progesterone, testosterone, and that family of hormones dramatically. Now, this may actually be one of the reasons why ketogenic diets work in epilepsy, because these are neuroactive hormones. But you might not want your progesterone and testosterone to go down the tank. And in human studies, we see in young women who are doing a ketogenic diet to control their epilepsy, we see amenorrhea, loss of periods, that equals infertility, or at least most of the time equals infertility, and severe menstrual irregularities in all of them, not in some of them, in all of them. But here's the cool exception. Lowering your testosterone is good in PCOS, and this is actually the mechanism behind why a ketogenic diet may be therapeutic in PCOS. We have clinical trials to show that. But PCOS is a very different hormonal situation than what most other women face. So in PCOS, this mechanism that is decreasing testosterone is why women with PCOS can go on a ketogenic diet and get pregnant. Like, how awesome is that? But if you do not have PCOS, if you are a stressed individual, chances are your hormones are anywhere from normal to suppressed, so suppressing them further with diet is going to cause infertility. So you actually have both sides of this coin, and this is where it becomes really important to know who you are, what your health status is, and what your goals are before you do a ketogenic diet. Now, you guys all know I love the immune system. It's kind of my thing. And so let's talk about the ketogenic diet effects on the immune system. There's actually a fairly large collection of studies that are starting to tease some of these effects out. So some of the earliest studies were actually looking at rheumatoid arthritis and looking at whether or not a ketogenic diet could be effective. And this comes from observations, again, that fasting is effective in rheumatoid arthritis. So we know that short-term, like 7-day fasts, can be therapeutic in a variety of conditions. It's really interesting. We can talk about that at a later date. So let's try ketogenic diet, right? This is our solution to fasting. You get to have the metabolic benefits of fasting without actually dying of starvation. It's awesome. But in rheumatoid arthritis, it either kept things about the same or made it slightly worse. And when we actually look at the details of how that's affecting the immune system, we can see that it's not. It's not actually resolving inflammation. If anything, we're starting to see, at least in 7 days, things getting worse. Now, 7 days is not a long time. We know that there's other symptoms that are consequences of ketogenic diet that as the body sort of adapts to using ketones, they go away. So does that happen with this effect on the immune system? Well, studies in cancer show that no. Studies in cancer show that the effects on the immune system magnify over time. And we're starting to understand how a ketogenic diet may actually selectively impact certain aspects of the immune system in a way that's beneficial for treating cancer. So we see a normalization of the immune system in cancer that allows the immune system to more effectively detect cancer cells and kill them. So that's great, except for that the way that the immune system is dysfunctional in cancer is really the opposite of the way the immune system is dysfunctional in all other chronic illnesses. And what is good for cancer is not necessarily good for other situations where inflammation is a problem. And here's sort of an extra complication. So a mechanistic study looking at the effects on the immune system in multiple sclerosis actually showed that what was happening in the brain was completely different from what was happening in the rest of the body. So we're starting to deal with a situation where the effect on the brain might be the benefit, and the effect on the rest of the body might be the detriment. And depending on what's going on in your body, you may or may not want that. So the last mechanism I want to go into in detail is the effect of the ketogenic diet on the gut microbiome. And there was a seminal paper published last year, I think, that put people, humans, on a plant-based diet versus an animal-based diet, which looked like a ketogenic diet. They actually were in ketosis. They measured that in this paper and looked at the effects on the gut microbiome. This is an awesome paper. It's an awesome paper that you need to read in great detail to actually understand it. So the first effect that they saw was an increase in bacteria in Bacteroidetes phylum and a decrease of Firmicutes. So that sounds awesome. And that sounds awesome because that's the complete opposite of the gut microbiome that is now being associated with obesity and being associated with the health detriments of obesity. So we know the gut microbiome is critical to our health. We know that a diverse gut microbiome is one of the best things we can possibly have. And we know that the ratio of Bacteroidetes to Firmicutes is really, really important. But that's the phylum level. When we start to look in more details, we can see some changes in the gut microbiome that are not just less positive, but incredibly worrisome. And this paper detailed that. So in this shift, we saw a huge decrease to nearly nothing of bacteria of the family Prevotella. Now this is important because Prevotella make up 53% of the phylum Bacteroidetes in hunter-gatherers, in centenarians. So when we look at some of the longest lived populations in the world, we can see Prevotella in their guts. I mean, their poop, but whatever. We see that Prevotella in your digestive tract reduces your risk of disease. This seems to be one of the most important probiotic organisms. We know it's incredibly sensitive to your fiber intake, especially over the long term. And we are starting to see this as being a therapeutic target. It's a cool family of bacteria. So Prevotella are a type of Bacteroidetes. So we're seeing an increase in Bacteroidetes, great, but not Prevotella, the ones we want. We're seeing an increase in Bacteroides, not to be confused with Bacteroidetes, the words look the same. That may be good. There are lots of probiotic strains of Bacteroides that we understand as having tremendous therapeutic potential. They also happen to be a major source of clinically significant pathogens. And we don't know from this paper what type of Bacteroides we're getting. However, what this paper did look at, I want to show you the Prevotella here first. So, do I have a laser pointer? Woohoo! Okay, so this is a hunter-gatherer microbiome. This is a Westerner microbiome. So you can see this great ratio in Bacteroidetes, green over here, to red. That's good. That's what we want. We see the opposite in a Western microbiome, and it's even more exaggerated in obesity. But here, look at this Prevotella. This is a huge, huge, huge chunk of a hunter-gatherer's microbiome, right? Who we look at as being some of the healthiest, most robust people on the earth, who we love so much, we emulate them in as many things as we can do without giving up the comforts of Western society. So I mentioned the potential increase in pathogens. This paper that was published in Nature was actually able to see that. They saw that in a dramatic increase in Bilophia wadsworthia, say that 10 times fast, pathogenic bacteria that has been linked to a variety of extremely serious infections, including autoimmune disease. There was also an increase in fungi, including Candida, but other fungi as well, which, Candida can be a pathogen. A little bit is okay, and our digestive tract's a lot. It's not cool. Although I think the research in understanding the rules of different fungi in our digestive tracts is still really in its infancy. So why do I care about the effect of the gut microbiome and what a ketogenic diet might do to it? So the ketogenic diet dramatically decreased the diversity of the gut microbiome in this study. And that is the complete opposite of the one thing we can say really conclusively about the role that these lovely little pets we have in our digestive tract have on our health, is that a lot of different kinds leads to the best impact on our health. It leads to the most resilience of our health. And we understand that because they all have slightly different effects, but as a team, especially a team that are made up of the better ones and not the less good ones, they help digestion, they produce short-chain fatty acids, which improves the health of the cells that line our digestive tract, they synthesize vitamins, they increase nutrient absorption, they produce neurotransmitters, they actually can affect how leaky your blood-brain barrier is. And they regulate the immune system. So we're coming back to the effects on the immune system, which are very likely direct and indirect from a ketogenic diet. So we care, right? We care about this. There are some other potential mechanisms to explain some of the adverse reactions. The science behind these is far less conclusive. So I can't tell you without a shadow of a doubt that this is a problem to worry about, but I do think it's important mentioning, if I'm going to give you some education into the side effects and potential adverse reactions, that there are 2 studies showing detriment to thyroid health. that there are a number of studies showing kidney dysfunction, increases in kidney stone rates, although that's mixed results. There's other studies that show no effect. As I promised, I was going to touch on the high cholesterol and high triglycerides that can be caused by a ketogenic diet. So here's the thing. Whole pile of studies shows it makes it worse. Whole pile of studies show it makes it better. And then there's the studies in between that show no effect. These studies differ in exactly how a ketogenic diet was implemented, in the population of people, in the length of time a ketogenic diet was performed. We see in some studies people will have a transient increase in cholesterol and triglycerides, and then it'll come back down. Others, it appears to continue rising. Others will have a benefit. There's a lot going on here, and we do not know how generally the ketogenic diet affects cholesterol and triglycerides. I can't tell which one of you, if you're going to try a ketogenic diet, what's going to happen to your cholesterol and triglycerides. You're going to need to monitor it. But we have seen in these epilepsy trials that this high cholesterol and triglycerides has led to heart disease and heart attacks in children. So there's the potential for this to be really harmful. But we don't understand enough from the research who it's going to harm and who it's going to be actually awesome for. You could have the opposite reaction. But there is a slight indicator that your ApoE genotype may be important here. So we have some papers that show that ApoE carriers don't respond to a ketogenic diet. That's about 25% of us. And for example, we know that if you're an ApoE carrier, you are 15 times more likely to get Alzheimer's and not respond to a ketogenic diet as a therapy for Alzheimer's. So this is important stuff to mention, but take this all with a grain of salt because the jury is still out in terms of the science. So the implications. What does it mean that there's these hormone effects? What does it mean that there's these immune effects? What does it mean that there's a change in the gut microbiome that is potentially harmful? Well, the hormone effects is probably why women tend to respond less well to ketogenic diets than men. It's why we see this benefit in PCOS and why we see loss of periods and infertility in other women. The immune effects imply that if you have not cancer, but any other type of systemic inflammation, that this could be a problem. And the gut microbiome effects really make us ask a lot of questions. Is this a good strategy? And what this leads to is an individual's cost-benefit analysis. So this is the cost of a ketogenic diet, but maybe the benefits are worth this risk for you. But you need to know what the costs are before you can even do this analysis for yourself. So I want to end on, are ketogenic diets seen in the wild? Do we see this in healthy people? Do we see a benefit? And of course, the only hunter-gatherer population that has a diet that really approaches the macronutrient ratios of a ketogenic diet are the, depending on where you come from, you might call them Inuit or Eskimo. I go Inuit. And what's really fascinating about this diet, as a general rule, they actually eat too many calories from carbohydrates to be in ketosis, but seasonally, their diets will change and they will get into a diet that is actually much more ketogenic. But Inuit do not go into ketosis following an 80% fat diet, or at least 94% of them don't. So wait, what? 94% of the Inuit have a gene mutation in the CPT1A gene. It's called the P479L variant, for those of you who want to Google it later. This gene is a rate-limiting enzyme for a long-chain fatty acid oxidation. So oxidation of fat is necessary for the development of ketone bodies. And if you can't do that, you don't produce ketone bodies. And so what happens in the Inuit, although they can go into ketosis through true fasting, they don't do it in a high-fat ketogenic diet type state. And this may be why this population of people respond so ridiculously badly to more Western diets. But it also begs the question, if long-term ketogenic diets are so beneficial, if they are so amazing, if they are a panacea that can improve our health for everything, why does the only population of hunter-gatherers in the world that has a diet that looks like this have a gene mutation to prevent it? That is a question that we cannot answer, but I think it is definitely one to think about as we look at the adverse reactions to ketogenic diets. So I already said that I believe ketogenic diets, they have such tremendous therapeutic potential that we need to be thinking about these as a drug. Let food be thy medicine. In this case, we're going to take that a lot more literally. But when you're seeing these wonderful, success stories, these clinical trials purporting all the benefits of a ketogenic diet, there's something that I want you to remember. I want you to remember that individual results may vary, right? The number one disclaimer of any drug. And I want you to remember that there are side effects, potential adverse reactions, and that these can potentially be life-threatening. This is not something to be taken lightly. So that doesn't mean that a ketogenic diet isn't right for you. So what should you do if you want to try it? If you do have epilepsy or a neurodegenerative disease, if you have multiple sclerosis, if you want to try it for fat loss, what do I recommend? I recommend close, like super close, like preferably living on your couch in the living room close, medical supervision. So your doctor needs to know that you're doing this and needs to be aware of what the possible complications are and aware of what type of testing to do to look for all of these bad things that could happen before they happen. So that means lipid panels, because you might benefit and you might not, or you might have this transient increase in lipids that then goes down. Keeping an eye on your heart, keeping an eye on your kidneys, keeping an eye on your liver, keeping an eye on infection and inflammation. If you are finding yourself more susceptible to infection, that is a really good clue that this is negatively impacting your immune system. Keep an eye on your thyroid, even though the science there is still pretty minimal. Keep an eye on your hormones. That could involve hormone testing, but also looking at symptoms of hormone dysfunction. Unfortunately, when we destroy our hormones, it's a very, very long, difficult, challenging process to fix. So we don't want to destroy those if we don't have to. And so maybe you even want to look at your hormone levels before trying a ketogenic diet, especially if you're a woman. So I hope I have given you some food for thought. I hope I have provided you with that fine print, right? That list of what do we need to know about that could go wrong if we're going to do this. And I think you've seen probably 200 different citations. It's not a small amount of research that has gone into this. So if you like my science, you probably like my books, you probably like my website, and thank you very much. Jimmy, you promised you'd be first.
Good talk.
Thank you.
And we're friends, by the way, so
Yeah.
I'm not going to bash her at all. A lot of information thrown really fast at people, and I don't want people to leave thinking, oh my gosh, 200 studies, that's awesome. I want to know how long the studies are in a lot of these, because it looked like some of the ones that you did cite the actual time, it was like 7 days.
Yeah.
That is not a ketogenic diet. It takes at least 2 to 4 weeks to get into that keto-adapted state where you're running on ketones. Then the other variable that hasn't been talked about either is, in these studies, are they actually doing ketogenic, where they're measuring for ketones in some way or fashion? Because that's important. Mm-hmm. You know, you can label it ketogenic, that doesn't mean it's ketogenic.
Yeah.
Especially in the research world, low carb is 40% carbohydrates, but if I ate that, I'd never have ketones.
Yeah.
So kind of clarify, what kind of studies are we looking at here? Are they randomized controlled clinical trials? Are they rat studies? Because I think that really matters.
And I think that's an outstanding question, Jimmy. So the only short-term studies I think I quoted at all was the rheumatoid arthritis studies. Everything else is a month or longer. And all of the adverse reaction studies in epileptic children are at least a year. So they're very, very long-term. Some of them are as much as 5 or 6 years. The adverse reaction studies, the majority of them are non-controlled clinical trials. So they are admit children who have failed epileptic drugs, bring them into an institution where they're controlling their diet impeccably. They are measuring ketones, so they are actually checking that. So most of them are urinary analysis. I know that can be taken with a grain of salt, but some of them are actually doing blood analysis, which we all know is better. Some of them, what they do is they do urinary analysis, every few days, and then once a month they'll do a blood test because those are more expensive, or at least they certainly were more expensive 20 years ago. We know that exactly how you implement a ketogenic diet is important. And one of the things that's really interesting is that we have this great body of scientific literature, and I think you're alluding to this great body of scientific literature showing that high-fat diets, 60% fat to 80% fat, can cause some really bad things. And so there's a problem with not quite being in ketosis, where you're actually going to exaggerate the negative impact of a high-fat diet. And so that's why it's so important to actually be monitoring these. These studies were, especially the clinical trials, extremely well designed, the epilepsy trials. And I think that's where we have the long-term information. The mechanistic studies are really new. Most of that's done in animals, but that's of course how medical research works, right? So we have an observation, we have correlation, we have, hey, we noticed that ketogenic diets help people do this, let's understand it. That's how medical research works. We then, because people don't like to be cut open, is a thing, most of us, for science. And so we actually do the mechanistic studies on animals to understand not whether or not something is happening. We have the whether or not it's happening in humans, but we try to understand why. And that's how we advance our scientific understanding. And then we go back, right? So we decide, we figure out why, we figure out where we can manipulate the system, and then we go back to humans in more rigorous trials to figure out if we can manipulate that system in a positive way or what else might happen. And that's how drugs are developed. That's how scientific evidence comes out. And we're at a place with ketogenic diet research where we're still in the mechanistic phase. We're still trying to understand those mechanisms.
And I just wanted to make sure, one of the premises of your whole talk too was the ketogenic diet is a drug.
Yeah.
If it was the drug, it would be considered the greatest invention of all time as far as pharmaceuticals because of the power that it has. Mm-hmm. So, you could call that, the paleo diet could be called a drug if you're going to have that as the definition. So be very careful, I think, in describing a diet of real food as a drug, because I think that can confuse people. I understand your premise was, I'm going to lay out all the side effects like a drug, but it's not a drug, it's real food.
So one of the things that is really unique about a ketogenic diet compared to other diets is that in the epilepsy research, we are actually seeing the same pathways being manipulated by a ketogenic diet as we are seeing being manipulated by anticonvulsant drugs. And so it's actually doing the same things in the human body that a drug does. If I was able to turn a ketogenic diet into a pill, and some people are trying to, that suddenly we're looking at a class of substances that affect the body in the same way. And I think that some scientists would argue that a ketogenic diet, because of these pathways that are not being manipulated by other dietary strategies, makes a ketogenic diet very unique. That's why it makes it so therapeutic. That's also why it makes it a drug and why we need to understand what the other effects of manipulating those pathways are. Do we have a non-Jimmy question?
A lot of the ketogenic diets that were studied were soybean oil based. I was wondering if you could comment if that could adversely affect things with the high linoleic acid, oxidized linoleic acid.
Mm-hmm. I think it would be short-sighted to assume that fat quality doesn't have anything to do with this. But the initial studies that did show adverse reactions were done before refined oils. Right, this diet goes back to when butter and lard were the dominant oils. And a lot of the animal studies, lard is actually the fat that's used, and we all like lard, right? Like, that's yum. And it's a fat that we as a community embrace as being a really good fat. So the standard ketogenic diet, rat chow, just as an example, it's about 80% fat, and out of that fat, 92-ish% is lard, and 8-ish% is soybean oil. So no, that doesn't balance omega-3s to omega-6s, but at the same time, it's not the it's all inflammatory fats that I think we tend to sort of dismiss those studies as being irrelevant. So I think that when we start to look at mechanistic effects, when we start to look at the effect on the gut microbiome, I think that fat quality is definitely an issue. I think that the dominant force behind these effects is fat quantity. Yeah. One more question? I can't really see anybody because of these bright lights, but...
Yes, thank you. I appreciate your talk today, and a beautiful website, your paleomom.com. We really appreciate that. I'm wondering, you touched on the ketogenic diet for the use of cancer, and this brilliant and compelling body of work of Thomas Seyfried, Dominique D'Agostino, Finney Volek, and Michael Aids, who's speaking immediately after you. What do you think of the efficacy of the ketogenic diet combined with intermittent fasting for the prevention of cancer?
So I think that our scientific studies, have really focused on cancer treatment, and especially focused on cancers that don't have any other options, right? So we've seen it in non-resectable gliomas. And we've seen mixed results, but we've seen, I think, enough science to go, hey, there's something here and we need to pursue this farther. But when you look at cancer research as a whole and how that relates to diet, the number one diet factor that we see that reduces risk of every single cancer is high vegetable consumption. That is the number one thing that we see as being beneficial. And mechanistic studies would indicate that that's part of the effect that vegetables, the very positive effect that vegetables have on the gut microbiome and how those control everything. A huge part of that is the nutrients in vegetables, especially the phytochemicals, the vast majority of which we don't even understand how exactly they're working to be such amazing antioxidants and such amazing tools for the immune system to actually function normally. So I think that as a prevention strategy, I think that a diet that is as restrictive as a ketogenic diet is in vegetables, it's by no means a no vegetable diet. But I think that when we look at studies in cancer, we see a really big shift around the 5 to 8 servings of vegetables a day in terms of prevention. And a ketogenic diet, it's typically more in the, depending on how you're supplementing, if you're doing MCT oil, you're talking about more 2 to 3 servings a day. And I feel like it's just not enough for prevention. Now, that doesn't mean that if you, say, have a bursa gene, granted the effects on breast cancer are still mixed in the scientific research, but if you had a gene that you knew was going to dramatically increase your risk of cancer, like that gene, it's an interesting question to ask. I don't think we have the scientific research to answer it. But in that case, is it better to focus on a lot of vegetable content and overall nutrient-dense anti-inflammatory diet? Or is it better to be in ketosis and be manipulating the immune system in that regards? I don't think we have an answer.
I think perhaps if you stay away from the root vegetables and eat just your leafy greens, your dark green vegetables, you can have many more than 2 or 3 grams a day, and it's not limited to 15 or 20 grams. Many people do 100 grams a day on a ketogenic diet, so you can get the vegetables in that process.
I think that staying in ketosis with non-starchy vegetables becomes a balancing act. What we know from a lot of the gut microbiome research that's being done in especially hunter-gatherers is that that population of people who I think we can all agree are definitely people to be looking at to understand what's going on that they're doing in terms of diet and lifestyle that's leading to their good health. It's very typical for them to consume 100 to 200 grams of fiber a day, maybe 50 grams for the lower fiber hunter-gatherers. If you ate just spinach, you're looking at 100 grams of spinach to get that 50 grams of fiber. And some people will be able to be in ketosis with that, some people won't. And I think that it's a really interesting problem to figure out how we can biohack this, how we can have the benefits and avoid some of these negative impacts. But I think that how a ketogenic diet is typically recommended, how it's typically explained, people aren't doing that. People aren't eating 20 cups of spinach a day. I know we only had one more question ages ago. Can we do one more?
So
I'm sorry.
Nope.
We have another speaker coming up. Would love to have more questions. If you're willing, maybe just inside the expo floor, just out of respect for our next speaker, can congregate for more questions.
We will
but
go
have to
there.
wrap
I'm also
this up.
signing books at the Victory Belt table at 3 o'clock.